everybody, it's Mrs. Stone here. Last time I left you, we had read the first 8 chapters of The Twits by Roald Dahl and illustrated by Quentin Blake. So we're on chapter 6. So far we've met Mr. and Mrs. Twit and they're not particularly nice to each other. So they've been doing some really horrible things. We're going to find out what happens. The last thing that happened was Mr. Twit had cut down Mrs. Twit's walking stick. So she felt like she was shrinking. So we're going to find out what happens about that. Chapter 9, Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick. He'd done the same to the 4 legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried. "And you shrunk so much, your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "Oh, you've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck. And your body shrinks into your legs. And your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "Oh, how long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long have I got before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say no more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything you can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Oh, tell me!" she cried. Oh, tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. We've got a picture there of Mrs. Twit looking ever so frightened about what's happening to her. The next chapter, chapter 10, Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring onto the ground. "Stand here," he pointed to the iron ring and then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string. And when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied their ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. Then the upward pull became very strong. We can see from this picture that Quentin Blake's drawn Mrs. Twit tied to the iron ring and all those balloons stretching her upwards and upwards. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If these strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. I wonder if you can think about what it is. The next chapter, Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen to you. Oh dear, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit. And with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet and he took a knife from his pocket and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight!" he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever." We can see in the picture poor Mrs. Twit looking rather frightened at the fact that she is climbing further and further up. Walking stick still in her hand though. Next chapter, Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start coming down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and less, and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twits' petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky.